Hi, this is L. Andrew Cooper, author of the novel Crazy Time, A Bizarre Battle with Darkness and the Divine, and you are listening to The Graveyard Show.
Welcome to the Graveyard.
And welcome to another edition of the Graveyard Show podcast. I am your caretaker, and the graveyard is open. Well, it has been a while, my friends, and I hope all of you had a fantastic Halloween. And for those of you here in the States, I hope you had a great Thanksgiving holiday as well. Now, even though it has been a while in between podcasts, I have been busy. I uploaded in October my latest Catacombs of Horror, which is entitled My Favorite Scenes from the Return of Count Yorga. That's a little thank you from me to all of you out there who made the Count Yorga Vampire Catacombs of Horror such a success. And I have a little story about that in just a moment that happened during Halloween, which was just great. And then right before Halloween, I decided to try something a little different. I uploaded a Halloween loop for all of you to listen, get into the mood of Halloween with, and if you wanted to use it for a Halloween loop at your house, it was right there for you to use. And it's called The Caretaker's Graveyard, and it's what happens here in the graveyard when I'm away. Even I didn't realize how much stuff goes on when I'm not here. It's kind of crazy. So I hope you enjoyed that as well. It was really fun putting together. It was very last minute, but it just kind of hit me, and I was like, I've always thought about doing something like that, so I decided to just put one together, and I hope you guys enjoyed it out there as well. Now, very quickly, speaking earlier of Count Yorga, so there are a lot of you out there who have found the show on YouTube, and I'm really thrilled about this. I've been kind of on a YouTube rampage these last 6 weeks. I've been going onto all these different websites. I've been going down the rabbit hole like we all do when we're on YouTube. And, of course, doing so many interviews on the In Search of Darkness series, which is about 1980s horror. And synthwave is just kind of making this huge comeback. And, back in the 80s, it was just music, right? And now it's synthwave. And it's so popular. And it's so easy to just kind of go down the rabbit hole there. And I wanted to do something that I normally don't do, is do shout-outs to other websites. White Bat Audio is a great synthwave website to go to. Outside, of course, our friends over across the pond, Weary Pines. You always have to check them out, and I'll give you their details a little bit more, a little later on the program, where you can find their stuff. But White Bat Audio is one of the YouTube channels that I find myself always going to, and there's just great synthwave on there. And so that's one YouTube rabbit hole I went down. Another one is, I always say I'm a child of the 70s, but a product of the 80s. So, of course, I went down the rabbit hole of wrestling videos. Yes, I used to be a huge wrestling fan back in the day. I'm one of the reasons why wrestling became so popular, because I found it in the mid-80s like so many of us did and just got hooked on it. So that's another rabbit hole. And then there are these really cool jazz websites where they do like October jazz music and November jazz music. And for anybody out there that likes jazz, you can go find them on YouTube. They're great. You just turn them on and they have like a little animation that plays. And there's just really cool jazz going on in the background. So good for just background music if you're working or doing a podcast, for that matter. Well, you don't want to do that because then, anyway, it opens up a whole can of worms. But anyway, so those are some of the rabbit holes I was going down. But with YouTube and the Graveyard Show's channel on YouTube, I'm always on there just checking the analytics, making sure everything's good, just seeing what the numbers are. And, look, this program is not even a speck of dust in the world of YouTube or on the internet. So I have no, visions of grandeur here of like this show exists and everyone is better for it. I'm just a small little show, if that. So, as we were coming up to Halloween, I was looking, I can't remember the date. I want to say it was probably like the 29th or 30th, somewhere in there. And I was looking at the analytics, and there was this tremendous spike in the viewership of the Graveyard Show's channel. And I'm like, wait, either I'm reading this wrong or there's a really significant error. And I was like, what the heck is going on here? And it was a massive spike. And as it turns out, it was all of you that have found the Catacombs of Horror video on Count Yorga Vampire. Why? Well, a certain Svengoolie had featured Count Yorga Vampire on his program that weekend. And I guess a lot of you went online to look up more info on it. And thus, yes, I said thus the huge spike in the channel's viewership. And I've gotten a ton of new subscribers. So I want to thank Svengoolie for helping out little old me here and the Graveyard Show by featuring a film that it just so happens is just blowing up my YouTube channel. I never thought in my wildest imaginations that doing a Catacombs of Horror on Count Yorga Vampire would be by far the most popular thing I could ever have done. It's amazing how many of you out there are Count Yorga fans. If I knew this, I would have done more a long time ago. Because I thought I was one of the few people who even remembered what Count Yorga Vampire was. So thank you to everyone out there who have been joining me here in the graveyard or in my catacombs, and those of you who are new subscribers, and those of you who have been commenting. It's been a lot of fun these last like 5 weeks. So thank you for that. It's been fun. Because I don't do promo on this show. I just don't. It's a hobby. It's fun. I get to meet really cool people online and do great interviews with great guests. I didn't mean that I do great interviews. I mean, I have great guests on here and who provide great interviews. So thank you to everyone out there who have helped make this YouTube channel a growing channel and very successful. I also wanted to do another shout out to another channel. If you have not found it, it's The Horror Geek, aka Mike Brackett. And you can find him as The Horror Geek. And the show he does is called Sick Flicks. And he does these really funny, really witty recaps of movies. And he rates them with his very coveted barf bag rating. It's hilarious. It's funny. Mike responds immediately to comments. He's very active on his channel. And he, like myself, he keep getting hit with copyright infringements every time we upload something on YouTube. Whenever I upload Catacombs of Horror, I always get dinged with a copyright ban, not ban, but a copyright infringement label, which I get it. I understand that. It's just a pain in the ass because then you got to go through this whole process of like explaining why you're doing it. And I've gone through hell, editing and re-editing the Catacombs of Horror. So it's not like you could just pull it off line and just use it. So anyway, poor Mike and I both deal with this. And I just want to give him, some promo here, some free promo. Check out his channel. And he has different ways you can subscribe to the channel. And if you want to do like, I think it's like Patreon or something else. If you want to help support the channel, you can do that as well. A big fan of his show. You'll see some of my comments on some of his videos. He's funny. He's very witty. So check out The Horror Geek. And as you heard at the top of the show, author Andrew Cooper is going to be joining me here in just a moment to talk about his novel, Crazy Time, A Bizarre Battle with Darkness and the Divine. We're going to get into that in just a few minutes, but very quickly, let's take a look at some news and notes. Well, Terrifier 2 will be coming to VHS. Yes, I said VHS. On December 27th, and it's been reported by Bloody Disgusting and Fangoria. The VHS release is going to be available in 3 different options. The standard edition in black clamshell case, a big box variant, and an Art Crispies book style big box with a flip-open cover. So there you go. What's old is new again. The film has been cropped from its original aspect ratio to a 4:3 full frame, giving it the authentic VHS feel that many of us love and remember. And this version has been approved by the writer and director of the film, Damien Leone. By the way, you can catch my interview with Damien as we talk about Terrifier 2 back at Tombstone 54, so you can check that out. I wanted to send congratulations to Damien and his team for tremendous success of Terrifier 2. The film grossed more than $11 million in theaters on a $250,000 budget. You heard me right. Over $11 million in theaters on a $250,000 budget. Absolutely incredible. And just, wow, amazing. Congratulations, Damien. Very well done. Now, if you want to get Terrifier 2 on VHS, you can go to Witter Entertainment's website. Now, I see Witter and I think Witter, going German, so I'll spell it out. It's Witter Entertainment. So Witter Entertainment, you can go to their website and find out all the details on Terrifier 2 on VHS. In the meantime, you can find the film on digital, and you can stream it on Screambox. Now, speaking of Screambox, that other horror streamer is doing a Black Friday sale. They're offering their streaming subscription for 99 cents a month for 3 months. So for $2.97, you can get Screambox for 3 months. So you can get the details on their website, screambox.com, and when you subscribe, enter the promo code SCREAM99. And the offer is good through December 23rd. So December 23rd is the final day to get this offer, and you also have to be 18 years or older to join. And the Screambox subscription will auto-renew at the current price of $4.99 a month after the 3-month promo is up. So check it out. I know I am. Very quickly, I talked about Synthwave a little while ago, and of course I have to mention my friends across the pond, Weary Pines, Jamie Chambers, Don McLennan Jr. Of course, they are doing the soundtrack for In Search of Darkness 3. Which I just got my digital copy of, and I have yet to watch it because I don't want to stop it. I need to kind of do, if I don't do the 5-hour block, I have to at least do a 2 or 3 hour block. So I got that, and I hope you were able to take advantage of the offer back in October to purchase In Search of Darkness 3. I can't wait to see it. I saw a little snippet of it. David Weiner, the director of the film, was kind enough to share some of it with me before his previous appearance here on the program, and it looks great. So I can't wait to check it out. But the boys over at Weary Pines, you can check out their music at their website, wearypines.com. That's WEARYPINES.com, and you can stream them as well on any of your favorite music sites. Stay tuned after the interview, and I will give you some details on my year-end show that I will be putting together, and also what I have in store for the Graveyard Show podcast in 2023. But as you hear in the background, my latest grave is being added to the graveyard. And when that happens, that means my guest is here, and it's time for me to get to work. Joining me now is Andrew Cooper, whose new novel, Crazy Time, A Bizarre Battle with Darkness and the Divine, is now available. He is also the author of Burning the Middle Ground, Dario Argento and Gothic Realities, The Impact of Horror Fiction on Modern Culture. And it's a real pleasure to welcome Andrew inside the graveyard. Andrew, thank you for joining me here on the program.
No, thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
Well, it's great to have you here, and I really look forward to talking to you about your book, Crazy Time, A Bizarre Battle with Darkness and the Divine. So why don't you tell everybody out there what your book is about?
Well, Crazy Time is about a woman who experiences so much trauma, goes through so many horrific experiences that she begins to think that she is cursed. And even though she's an agnostic, the evidence piles up. She begins to think she is cursed by God. And so, because she's an agnostic, she doesn't run to church right away. She consults all kinds of people. She goes to a psychic. She goes to a Satanist. She does talk to a preacher eventually, and it becomes a grand quest to find out why the universe is out to get her. And she actually does find answers of a sort, and ends up in a kind of cosmic battle. And it is a very, very dark journey.
So the title itself is very interesting. How did you come up with that?
It points in a few different directions. One of the keys to the novel is it's very difficult to tell when what she is experiencing is actually happening, and when what she's experiencing is a product of her mind. She often wonders whether she is going crazy. So she's not only having a crazy time, but she may in fact be involved in any time that is a time of mental instability. And I added the subtitle, A Bizarre Battle with Darkness and Divine, not because it's a classic battle between good and evil. People have misunderstood that about the book, but because she is literally battling both the darkness that seems to be coming after her, and she's battling the divine. She ends up thinking God is out to get her, so she ends up going out to get God. so she is fighting both sides.
Well, I mean, the story is definitely an interesting one, and something I think you never really hear that. It's usually, the battle with the devil or a battle with evil. So how did the idea of this story come to you?
Well, I first drafted the book quite a few years ago, or about 6 or 7 years ago, and I had just been through one of the roughest times in my life, and I kind of felt like the universe was out to get me, and I thought, hey, this is a relatable idea. I think a lot of people get that feeling at least once or twice in their lives when things are going to hell. And so I started thinking about that concept. And even though I'm not a particularly religious person, I thought of the book of Job in the Bible, in which the God and the devil basically make a bet about how much. I don't know what kind of language I can use in this interview, but how much
whatever you want,
how much shit they can put this poor guy Job through, and see if he can still be standing at the end of it. And I thought, well, what if somebody believed that was happening to them? And so my main character, Lily Henshaw, was born, and the story just kind of spun out from there. I didn't want to make her super religious. I wanted to make her a pretty regular person. She's a little smarter than the average person, I think. But yeah. So my idea about everybody feeling like God or the universe is out to get them sometimes became a kind of epic, horrific quest.
So it sounds like there's a lot of religion in the book in terms of what you need to establish your story. So is this something that you had to go into maybe like the Bible to read up on some stuff, or was religion something that was a part of your life that you could just pull from when you were putting this story together? How much did you have to do in terms of doing research for religion and God?
Well, I grew up in the South. I grew up with religion around me, and I was a Southern Baptist until my early teens. So I definitely had it in my background. But I also had to do research. I studied the book of Job a lot and read a lot of different interpretations of it. And I also draw from the book of Revelations and the book of Exodus in the novel. So I had to read up on those as well. But particularly the book of Job, when writing the early chapters of the novel, I often had a web version of the King James Bible open and tabbed back and forth between my manuscript and the Book of Job as I was writing. So it was a pretty intense engagement. But I don't want people to think that it is a religious novel, because it is not. It is not always friendly to questions of faith.
Sure. Yeah. As there can be. I mean, that is something that does come up in this genre of horror that, even in some dramas too. I mean, you have people questioning faith and questioning, if there is a God out there. So how long did it take you to write the book?
Well, the first draft probably took about 6 months. But as I mentioned before, I wrote it, I think, entirely in 2016 or so, and shelved it and took it out every now and then and tinkered with it, and then published it this year. So I think it aged well, like a fine wine on my shelf, and grew into what it is now. But the bulk of the writing probably took about 6 months.
Okay. So becoming an author, when did you decide this is the path that you wanted to take?
I kind of always knew. I didn't finish a novel until I was 18. I didn't publish that one. It's a piece of crap. But I think I first tried writing a novel in the second grade or so, and I was writing short stories and sharing them with friends by the third grade, and entering contests and stuff around then. So I've always wanted to write, but I didn't study creative writing in school. I studied regular old English and went the professor route for a while. So it wasn't a real focus until more recently. I've been focusing on my writing. So it's always been there. I've always been doing it, but I haven't always been as focused as I am now.
Yeah, I wanted to actually ask about that, because as an author, obviously there's some writers have very disciplined work ethics. Some have, very, kind of very different work ethics in terms of how they put their books together, how they write. Talk about being an author, the life of an author, how you go through the process of writing a book.
Well, I am a big outliner. Often the question is, are you a pantser or a plotter? Do you fly by the seat of your pants and make it up as you go along, or do you plot things out very carefully? I am definitely a plotter. I start with at least a major point outline, and sometimes go into smaller and smaller points before I actually start drafting, because I like to write in layers. There are often things going on thematically and symbolically at the same time as the plot and characters are developing. So if I don't have a map to the plot, it's very easy for me to get lost. So I always start with making those maps and taking notes on my world and taking notes on my characters, and then I write usually in order from start to finish. Though as I also edit as I write. So every time I sit down to draft new stuff, I go back to old stuff and hash through it first to pick up the threads and make sure everything is connected. So that's my overall process. As far as my daily life is concerned, I'm usually slow in the morning and faster in the afternoon. So sometimes in the mornings I'll just stare at the screen and think, okay, something's going to happen, and then later in the day things will be happening. But if I don't write at least every weekday or so, I'll feel like there's something missing in my life.
Okay, because I know, like with screenwriting, when you put a script together, there are certain, at least there used to be, there were certain pages that things had to happen. Like you had to have, like, within the first 5 pages of the script, this had to happen. Within the first 10, this had to happen. And generally you were getting into your movie by the 30th minute. And I've heard some film critics and reviewers say that when the movie starts getting going, if you looked at your watch, it was usually within the 30th minute of the movie. It was when you're getting into it. For novels, is there such a process where chapter 1, this has to happen, or by chapter 5, or by page 50, this has to happen? Because I was always curious about that, if novels had sort of those same rules or basis that a screenplay has for movies.
It depends on who you ask. I've also been getting into screenwriting in the last few years, and I've written a number of screenplays. None have been produced yet, but I've done pretty well on the festival and competition circuit. And sometimes I use what they call beat sheets for screenplays, where what you're talking about is you have to hit certain beats in the first 10 pages, certain beats by the end of Act 1, which is usually 20 pages or 20 minutes in, and so on and so forth. Novels novel writing doesn't usually involve quite such prescriptive timing, but people will tell you that you need to establish certain things with your hook in the first chapter and just establishing characters and so on. But I don't put a lot of stock into that. I'm a much more experimental writer, so I don't tend to follow what some people will call rules, and I think of as suggestions that can be blithely dismissed. Mm-hmm. So again, it depends on who you ask. I do think it's important to establish characters and at least a plot trajectory within the first chapter or two. Otherwise, people will feel like they have nothing to hold on to. But I do things that are not strictly what people think have to be done for marketability.
Sure. Yeah, I'm always curious about that, and I'm sure there's some people who are listening who have thought about becoming an author. So I always like to try to put that out there just to kind of give them an idea, because I think a lot of us just don't consider that, right? You go to a movie or you read a book and you're just kind of like, oh, it's just going to kind of happen, and then if you start analyzing it and looking at it, you're like, oh, this is what needs to happen here. Oh, this is what needs to happen there. And sure, it's like anything, right? You have what are the quote unquote rules of a book or a movie, but they are guidelines because, as you said, you have a different writing style, and obviously it's successful because you've published so many books already. So you must be doing something right. Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Well, I'm doing all right, but I'd like to be doing much better. So maybe if I followed the rules better, I would be rich and famous by now. But I'm not rich and famous. So, but rules just don't speak to me. Who knows?
I like that. I like that because it just I think sometimes we can get tied to the rules of whatever it is so much that it just kind of sucks the life out of something. So now as a writer of horror. That seems to me to be something that might be, I don't want to say more difficult, but maybe I will. Let's just say more difficult than most genres, because you're trying to present horror in a written form. So you're relying on readers to fill in the gaps and visualize what you're presenting. So I'm wondering if you ever have found yourself second guessing when you're writing something.
All the time.
Yeah,
all the time, because horror and I think comedy as well. You're depending on affect. You're depending on emotional response, and you can't control that directly. There are tricks of the trade. Stephen King has itemized them in several pieces that he's written. There are pressure points that you can hit with, and I do this in Crazy Time. I've got a scene with bugs. I've got, I could have all kinds of trigger warnings on this book. trigger warning, this book will trigger you. But there are things you can do to freak people out, and they're time tested and approved. But in general, when you're trying to create an atmosphere of dread, you're trying to create surprises, you're trying to create different emotional responses. Different people react in different ways, and so you can't guarantee you're going to get what you want. And so yes, the constant process of second guessing and wondering if you're pushing the right button and pushing it hard enough. So there's a lot of guesswork and hoping. Lots of hoping.
Yeah, I can only imagine. Now, when you are you a self-publisher, or do you actually have a publisher that you go through?
Crazy Town, I published myself. It's the first time I've ever tried self-publishing. It's such a very, very weird book. That's why I put the word bizarre in the subtitle, because I want people to know they're up against something bizarre. Reviewers have referred to it as a surreal world. A traditional publisher would be likely to snap it out with some reviews and other things behind it. So I decided to experiment with self-publishing. My other 2 novels have been published were with indie presses, and the nonfiction you mentioned, Gothic Realities and Dario Argento, were both through academic presses. And I've also had some edited books that I've done that have gone through smaller presses. So I've done a little bit of this and a little bit of that.
Well, this is good because you now have experience on both ends. So I'm curious, as far as working with a publisher versus working as a self-publisher, can you give us some bullet points as to what the differences are?
The main difference I have found with the self-publisher, being a self-publisher, of course, is that all the choices are mine to make. So there's a lot more freedom there, but there's also a lot more responsibility, because I've been doing all of my own marketing, and that has involved more of an investment. So there's no sharing of responsibility with another entity, like a publisher. But at least with small presses or indie presses like I've used, there is really a sharing of responsibility, in that with the smaller presses, you do have a lot of responsibility for marketing and other things too. So it's not a huge difference.
Yeah.
There are a lot of similarities in the 2 experiences. I'm thinking about self-publishing again. I've actually been tinkering with another collection of short stories. I've published short story collections with indie presses before, but I've never done one on my own. So I'm thinking about doing it again. So it's a balance between freedom and freedom to do what you want, and freedom to unburden yourself a little bit.
Yeah. Well, I was wondering, as a self-publisher, do you have an editor that you go to outside of that, or is this something where you just you trust yourself as the editor, and you write it and then you submit it?
Well, the common wisdom that I recommend that people follow is go to an editor. But because I have a PhD in English and I taught writing for 10 years, I do trust myself as an editor, so I don't follow that common wisdom.
Sure.
I edit myself.
Sure, yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, I totally understand that. Now, you write horror, and I was curious, were you a fan of horror when you were younger? Is that something that was a part of your life that got you interested in it, or is it something that you became more interested as you got older?
I have many different ways I can try to explain it, but I've been a horror freak my entire life. I first started wanting to dress up as a vampire when I was like 4 years old, and I would sneak and watch horror movies, even though they gave me terrible nightmares, and it drove my parents crazy. So I have always had a large morbid streak, and have been drawn to horrific things. So we can go Freudian on that. We can I don't know where we want to go with that, but it's just the way I've always been.
We can go wherever you want to go with it. Were there specific, like, I know as as a kid, obviously when I was younger, the classics were still fairly new. Dracula, Frankenstein weren't that old yet, but it was pre, Friday the 13th and stuff. So I kind of, when I was really young, it was like that sweet spot of like B movies, Hammer, American International. That was sort of like my wheelhouse as a young kid. And then as I was growing up, teenage years and pre-teenage years, it was, all of a sudden the gore fest started with, Friday the 13th and Nightmare on Elm Street and stuff. What was it that, because as a kid, I was a big fan of the Christopher Lee Dracula film. So whenever that was on in New York, in New Jersey, it was on and I was watching it. I probably watched those movies more than a lot of films. What were some of your favorites?
Well, I grew up. No, my younger years were in the 80s, so I grew up with the slashers and things like that. But before I could really handle them, I loved the American International stuff. I mean, I'm sitting right now with a poster of Vincent Price over my right shoulder. I loved anything Vincent Price was in.
Nice, nice.
So I also had a fixation on those films. But then when I was finally after I got over nightmares from Night of the Living Dead and some of those other more intense films, and my parents let me watch the slashers. I when I was maybe 10, 11 years old, I had a big poster of Freddy Krueger on my wall. So I became fixated on those types of figures as well. I also started reading Stephen King when I was 9 years old. So I had those icons in front of me from a very early age.
Sure. Yeah, that's great. So talk about Stephen King. I mean, King is obviously, I mean, you could say he's the greatest horror writer who ever wrote. I mean, some people will say Poe, some may say Lovecraft. As far as King for you, where does he stand as far as his impact?
Well, it's not the most original fixation to have had, but again, I did start reading him when I was 9. I remember, I think it was 6th grade. One of the classes I was in had to dress up as who you want to be when you grow up, and I dressed up as Stephen King and came in and talked about my children and things, because I read a biography of him, and that was what I wanted to be. So he definitely had the most formative influence on me of all the writers that I read when I was young. And I haven't read him as much in recent years. I don't know his recent work as well as I know his early work. But he's just got an amazing voice, and he was able to take sort of familiar figures from those movies from the 60s, like that we were talking about, and transform them into a more current idiom, and make them scary and accessible to younger generations, to newer people, and he's still doing that now. So he is incredibly talented, and I admire him quite a lot. Greatest that ever lived? I don't know. I've studied 300 years of horror, and I don't know if I can pronounce the greatest who ever lived. But he's certainly, I think, he earned a place in history and should be studied for centuries to come, because he has made such a mark on our culture.
Yeah, I know. I don't think people realize what King meant at that time in the 70s and the 80s, because now we kind of look back on it and go, oh, it's Stephen King, he's just part of the culture now, he's just, it's like baseball, it's just there. And he, I mean, my gosh, I remember, when, Salem's Lot came out on TV, the 2-night event, and what that meant, and The Shining, and his books. I mean, I remember, my mom would be reading Stephen King books, and she was, that wasn't her thing, but she just loved his stuff. And we'd have Stephen King books everywhere, and it's like the American Express commercial that he did, and just Creep Show, being involved with Romero on that. it's amazing how he went from being like this popular, amazing author to a cultural icon. And I want to swing back to something that you just mentioned. So you said you've studied 300 years of horror. I'm not going to ask how long that takes to do, but but as far as because I mentioned the obvious, right? King, Lovecraft, Poe. Is there someone that in those years that you've studied that you could look back on and say, I don't think this individual gets enough credit or gets any credit or gets any recognition? Maybe an underappreciated individual in the horror genre or individuals that may come to mind. I'm just curious.
So overlooked individuals in the history of horror. Well, I have some favorites. I mean, I think anybody who's interested in the history of gore horror has to know Matthew Lewis's The Monk from the 1790s. I'm also very fond of a book called The Confessions of a Justified Sinner by James Hogg, and that's from 1824. An author named Arthur Machen is a great precursor to Lovecraft without all the problematic racism. And he was writing in the, I think, 1880s, 1890s. So I recommend picking up The Great God Pan. Stephen King is a big fan of The Great God Pan. Also, The Three Impostors is a great read. So those are three that come to mind right away. I could probably keep listing off favorites from the 19th century, but those are some to chew on.
That's great. That's some amazing stuff. Now I have to go back and find some of these. That's awesome. I mean, was it something that just happened that you started studying horror like this, or was it something that you had always wanted to do?
Well, I didn't pay that much attention to horror when I was in college, but then I got to grad school and realized I had to specialize in something, and my brain said, well, you've always been obsessed with horror, why not study that? Which wasn't necessarily popular with my advisors, because generally when you go to grad school for English, you're supposed to like pick a century or something, but instead I chose to look at the 18th, 19th, 20th, 21st centuries and look at literature and film, and just anything horror-wise was fine with me for my dissertation. And so that's where I went.
Well, you really caught my attention when I saw the Dario Argento book that you did. So how did that come about?
The Argento book started as a side project when I was in grad school, because I didn't actually discover Argento when I was the horror buff that I was talking about as a tot and a teen. I really discovered him when I was in grad school, and I just went absolutely nuts about how brilliant he is. So I started talking about him in conferences. I published a paper about him. And once I was out of school and teaching, I couldn't let go. So I kept writing about him. I kept reading about him, and suddenly I was writing a book about him, and publishers were interested, and so I got the book out. I didn't actually get to meet him until after the book published, but I finally did get to meet him and talk to him, and I think he's brilliant, and his films influenced my writing a lot. I strive for some of the irrational, jarring effects he achieves in his films in my writing. So he's incredibly important to me, and if any listeners out here happen to have missed his works, I mean, you have to at least see Suspiria and Deep Red, but I happen to like all of them, except for maybe Phantom of the Opera.
I didn't. I checked out on that one, and I just saw Dark Glasses, and I didn't really enjoy it.
I haven't seen Dark Glasses yet, I have to confess.
Yeah, it's disappointing. At least for me, it was. But I will say this. Yeah, I think Deep Red might be my favorite Argento. And it's funny. I've had a topic on here about Suspiria, and maybe you and I can have a separate conversation on another podcast about it. But I'll save it for another time. But yeah, I totally agree. I mean, I think Argento at his best is one of the finest filmmakers. I love the dream quality and in his films. I even like, I mean, Inferno's fine, but I really enjoy, like, the finale is just fantastic in that film. He's able to do stuff that I think a lot of filmmakers just wouldn't be able to do or try to do and fail miserably.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. It's like, as I mentioned before, in talking about Crazy Time, I had at least one reviewer refer to reading the book as like entering a surreal world, and I feel like his best films anyway are the same way. You press play and you enter another world that is surreal and irrational, and you never know when a chimp might jump out with the straight razor, and
True.
And while I have not written a scene with a chimp and a straight razor, I like to create that kind of uncertainty in my world, so you never know what the fuck is going to happen.
It's so funny. I remember a friend of mine was telling me about Phenomena. He's like, you got to see that. Or at the time, I think it was Creepers, and they were like, you got to see this movie. I'm like, all right. And I remember watching when I was watching the last 10 minutes, I was like, what the fuck? I was going crazy. Like, this is awesome. It was just, again, Argento at his best, man. It's hard to beat. I mean, Bava and Argento, well, I mean, obviously Bava, influenced Argento a lot, but two great filmmakers. Hey, if anybody wants to find your Dario Argento book, is it available?
Oh, yeah. I mean,
Okay.
it's on Amazon, or you can get it directly from the University of Illinois Press, the publisher.
Oh, great. Okay. Because I would love to have you back on. We can maybe do a Dario Argento podcast one day based off your book. I would love to do that. I just have to get it. But that would be great. Now, speaking of your books, if people want to purchase Crazy Time or any of your other books, tell them where they can go.
Well, you can go to Amazon. You can go to Amazon.com, BarnesandNoble.com. It's on Kobo. It's on Google Play. It's most of the major websites have it. So, and it's available both in print and in ebook forms. So,
great.
Wherever you like to go, you can probably find it.
Fantastic. And then, as far as social media, is that something you do? And if so, where can people find you?
I'm not as active as I should be, but I am on Facebook. I am on Twitter. Facebook, L. Andrew Cooper is my author page, or if you really want to find me, I'm L. Andrew 42. And I'm L. Andrew 42 on Twitter. I have an Instagram account, but I have to confess I don't really use it. So those are probably the best ways to find me. And I have my own website/blog, which is landrewcooper.com.
Great. Well, this is awesome. Listen, Andrew, it was really great having you on the show. This was a great conversation. It went in a direction I wasn't expecting, and I really enjoyed. We're going to have you back on. We're going to do a conversation on Dario Argento, or maybe just on film criticism down the road. Listen, thank you so much for joining me here on the program. It was great speaking with you.
Well, thank you again for having me. I enjoyed it.
And as I put this interview to rest, I want to again thank Andrew for joining me here on the podcast. He was great about rolling with the punches with me, because I had to reschedule this thing a few times. It was stuff came up on my end, and it would be like the day before, and it was just one of those things where I hate doing it and going, oh, by the way, can we move it? But there are just times where things happen, and he was great about doing that. So I want to thank him publicly for hanging in there with me. Man, that interview was, that took a whole different direction with the whole 300 years of horror, studying horror. That's just great. And, again, another film critic, with the Dario Argento book, it reminds me of when I had Professor Christopher Sheridan from Seton Hall University many, many years ago. And you can find those on the Graveyard Show Classic on YouTube. where we talked film criticism. And I really will have Andrew back on this program to talk about Dario Argento, because I think we need to do that. It is a horror graveyard where we preserve the history of horror. And I mean, Dario Argento is certainly a tremendous part of that. And it'd be great to get his perspective on the different Argento films. So check out Crazy Time, a bizarre battle with darkness and the divine. And you heard Andrew, you can find it anywhere. Books exist, whether digitally or in print. Now, coming up in December, I will be doing my year-end show called Voices from the Grave. It's a podcast that features outtakes from this year's interviews that did not make it on their respective podcasts. So you're going to be hearing from 6 of my guests. You'll be hearing from Benjamin Lewis, who is the director and producer of Stoker Hills. Good friend of the program, David Weiner, director of In Search of Darkness and In Search of Tomorrow. Brendan Muldowney, who is the writer and director of The Cellar. Chris Sivertson, the director of Monstrous. Fernando Gonzalez Gomez, the co-director of The Passenger, and Addison Hyman, the writer and director of Hypochondriac. We're going to be hearing some of the questions that I asked them that either didn't make their podcast because of timing, or in a case of 2 of these interviews, we get into the end of the film. So I will give spoiler alerts, and I'm placing them at a good spot in the podcast. So you don't have to worry about jumping around. I'm going to group those together. But for The Passenger and Hypochondriac, I get into, or actually it's not, it's Monstrous and Hypochondriac. I get into the ending of those films. And I didn't want to do that, obviously, when they were first released. So they've been out a while now. So there you go. I started doing the Voices from the Grave podcast last year, and I just like the idea of doing an outtakes show versus a best of show that I used to do in previous years for the podcast. I just think it's more interesting. It's still new material, and it's a whole lot easier to do than putting a best of show together, especially back in 9 and 10 when I would do weekly podcasts. It was a ton of work. So anyway, so that's going to be the show that I wrap up the year with. This is the last original show of the year. So Voices from the Grave will be released about mid to late December to take us into 2023. And, of course, it will also include, yes, I know, I hear all of you out there, I know, Caretaker outtakes will be included as well. You get to hear me act like an idiot, because when I'm doing the show, it's generally me by myself here in the graveyard, or me and the dog in the graveyard. And, you kind of lose your mind after a while when you hear yourself talking over and over and over again, and you just get silly and stupid. So I will include some Caretaker outtakes as well. A reminder, if you are a podcast subscriber, you should seriously consider subscribing to the Graveyard Show podcast on YouTube. I'm going to be focusing more of my attention on providing more content for the GYS on YouTube. The last few years have allowed me a lot more flexibility to do interviews, but lately it's been getting a little tougher to schedule them. Unfortunately, I've had to not only reschedule interviews quite a bit this year, I've had to cancel interviews and not be available for interviews. It's just getting tougher and tougher. Again, this is a hobby, this isn't a job, and obviously there are things that have to take precedence over this podcast. So, growing the YouTube channel and seeing the subscribers starting to find the show and subscribe is very encouraging. So I'm going to be starting to provide a lot more content for YouTube. So if you are just a podcast subscriber, please go to the Graveyard Show podcast. There's no it's Graveyard Show podcast on when you go to YouTube. And you'll find it there. You'll see it. It's the same. It's the same. The same artwork of the hand coming out of the grave. And this doesn't mean I'm getting out of interviews and stopping my podcast. It's just that the podcasts are probably going to get more and more apart. Already, you see, it's been probably 7 weeks since my last podcast. So it's just what's starting to happen, and I can focus more attention on putting together Catacombs of Horror and other stuff. So if you subscribe to the GYS on YouTube, you'll get the Graveyard Show podcast. It will still be uploaded there. You will still have access to the Graveyard Show Classic podcast as well. And then in addition to that, you can find BC's Video Vault, which are the old Brian Collins movie review segments that were originally uploaded on the Graveyard Show podcast from 2009 and 10. I think there are 6 of them in total. It's just those segments, so you can find those. And then there's the new segment that I have for YouTube called The Caretaker Reveals. They're short video segments where I feature something I purchased or saw that is relating to the horror genre or science fiction. So the 2 that I have right now are up. It's the swag bundle that I got from In Search of Tomorrow, when I purchased the film and got the bundle of all that. And then the other one are 2 shirts that I got from Fright Rags. The latest one I'm going to be doing is going to be on the stage play 222, which was just recently here in Los Angeles. It was on a limited run, and my wife and I saw it not too long ago, and I'm going to do a spoiler-free review on 222. I highly recommend it. It's a great play. It's from England, and I'll get into more of that on The Caretaker Reveals. I'll also be showing the program, and I'll get into a little bit about it, but not very much. Also on YouTube, there's the George A. Romero wing that contains all interviews related to George Romero and his films, and I'm going to be giving that a little bit of a facelift soon. The latest wing that we added here in the Graveyard is the In Search of Darkness wing. I thought it just made sense because I've done so many interviews for In Search of Darkness between David Weiner, Robin Block, Weary Pines, and anything else I've done that's related to In Search of Darkness. So that has its own playlist on YouTube as well. And then, of course, Catacombs of Horror, which is the video production where I feature a topic that I wanted to discuss. So right now there are 4 of them. The first one, David Weiner joined me, and we talked about what best represents 1980s horror, and we pick what we think best represents 1980s horror in 4 different categories. The second one, Count Yorga Vampire, my favorite scenes. And then the latest one is my favorite scenes from The Return of Count Yorga. And there is my favorite scenes from Halloween 4, as well as the missed opportunity the series could have taken and why I think Halloween 4 is the most important film in the series outside of the original. That has picked up a lot since I re-uploaded it not that long ago, so it's great to see that. And more Halloween fans are always encouraged to come on in and comment. And if you do comment, I am fairly quick on replying on YouTube. And again, I appreciate all of you out there for supporting the Graveyard Show podcast on YouTube. So that's going to do it here for my final original program. I look forward to seeing you here in mid-December. We're going to do Voices from the Grave. And if you're new again to the program, you've got a ton to check out on YouTube. You have all the podcasts. Just everything is there. So please feel free to look around, enjoy. There's so many of you out there who have been so kind with your comments, and I appreciate them very much. It does mean a lot. So thank you so much. It's nice to hear from all of you out there. Again, I'm not on social media, so hearing from you on YouTube is the best way to get in touch with me. Or you can email the show, gyspodcast@gmail.com. But YouTube is the best way to really kind of connect. All right, my friends, I look forward to seeing you here very soon for Voices of the Grave. And as you exit the graveyard, I would like to remind you to please lock the gate behind you. We wouldn't want anyone to get out. Until next time.